And our first speaker is Dr. David Holmes, who will talk about the PROTECT AFib study.
Thank you. Well, it's again great to be up here and talk about some issues. We have talked about the PROTECT trial. We've mentioned that by name, and so I'm not going to review all of the data, although there is new data, but have some thoughts on issues as it relates to trial design and subsequent approaches that are going to be required for some of the issues related to regulatory approval for all of these devices. And so that's what I will focus on. I'll talk with you about my conflicts. They haven't changed over lunchtime, other than the fact it's about nap time. You've seen the Watchman device, and it's been shown to you, and so we don't have to spend any time on that, other than to say that Ted Feldman this morning talked with you about Gen 4 and Gen 5, and so this is technology that we haven't yet seen in the United States, that we will see in the United States as technology continues to improve going forward. This is an important slide. Ted showed this. It has some important implications. This was the patient study timeline for the PROTECT AF trial. For those of you that are interested in trial design and the importance of that, there are crucial pieces of information on this. The first piece of information is that indeed for this specific trial, the device group got warfarin for 45 days following implantation. Now, when the regulatory agencies look at that then, if there is a bleeding in a naive patient during the first 45 days, in patients who were randomized to the device, that bleeding and that event is blamed on the device. Think about that. It's blamed on the device. This next piece of information is that at 45 days then, patients are felt that if things are going well, that you should stop the warfarin. For those patients, for example, that at day 46 develop a pulmonary embolus because they took a long plane ride, and they then get put on warfarin for the next 6 months, any benefit that might have been attributed to the device is attributed to the warfarin. FDA looks at that and says, well, they're on warfarin. Of course, warfarin works. It's then attributed to the warfarin. Alternatively, in those patients who are in the control group that stop warfarin, if they have an event during that time, they say, well, it's a failure because they weren't on the warfarin that you said you were going to put them on. And so you're going to then get dinged for that. These have really important implications. So as you design a trial and go through the patient study timeline, there are issues related to that that are hugely important for how the trial is interpreted. The next piece of information to at least mention is the fact that, as you will remember, there was a primary efficacy endpoint and there was a primary safety endpoint. One of the issues was that the primary efficacy endpoint included safety events. So if there was a reduction in stroke as part of primary efficacy, but you then had a stroke, it was counted then potentially double. Suppose it was during the procedure. It was counted as a failure of the strategy as well as a failure of the device, despite the fact it might have been an air embolism. And so that is an incredibly important thing as the regulatory agencies look at these different devices that will be coming along. The next piece of information is to say, well, what about the statistical overview? The FDA looked at this stuff and they said, goodness sakes, maybe the probability scale that was used was wrong. Now, for those of you that are involved with trial design, You can see here that we felt that greater than 97.5% probability that primary efficacy event rate for Watchman is less than 2 times control. Now, statistics and probability in medical school were one of those courses that, gosh, came after lunchtime and was a good time for a nap. And so my sort of expertise with that is pretty limited. Maybe you all have much better expertise than I do. But you look at this, and the FDA looks at that and says, well, where did you come up with 2 times control? Statisticians did that. The company sponsor did that. It then becomes a source of controversy. Somebody says it should have been 1.75, not 2. You say, well, I don't know. I remember sleeping during statistics and probability. That really winds up being an issue then in terms of evaluation of trial design and then evaluation of the results of that trial, particularly if it's a non-inferiority trial. You have seen this data on the primary efficacy results, and you can see that looking at intention to treat, non-inferiority criteria were met. The FDA looked at that and said, gosh, there were some patients in whom you said they needed to have the device, but for some reason or other you couldn't put it in. Well, we're going to count those in even though they didn't have the device, because that's intention to treat. There are other different ways to approach it, but the FDA looks at that and says, well, this is intention to treat. The same is going to be true for LEOS 3, Richard. It's going to be intent to treat. And those patients that don't get it, that, for example, are randomized and then don't even undergo surgery, if they're randomized, then that's going to be a surgical sort of endpoint. And so those are important considerations for you to think about. And then you have safety. Now, this is an interesting piece of information. You remember efficacy included both safety and efficacy endpoints. You have seen the primary safety results. We can see at 600 patient years and at 900 patient years. Indeed, there was an imbalance because those patients that come to the catheterization laboratory have some events. That is true. That resulted in an increase in the rate compared to the control group, and you can see the relative rate there. Now, it's getting better at 900 patient years, and it's better at 1,500 patient years. It's better now at 5 years. But the primary endpoint, you remember, was at a year. So people look at that and say, gee, that is a substantial issue. Pericardial effusions, as you will remember, was the largest fraction of safety events in the device group. There were some stroke events related to air embolization. But this is an important piece of information. I want you to look at this and then remember some of the issues we've been talking about. The FDA looked at this and said, pericardial effusion and tamponade. My God. Well, in the PROTECT AF trial, indeed it happened, 4.8% of patients. There was no death or long-term disability, but it extended hospitalization. What have we talked about this morning that extends hospitalization that is not associated with death or long-term disability? Who knows? Pericarditis. That doesn't cause death or disability. What happens in your trial design, and I hope there will be a trial design, what if you go to the FDA and they say then, well, pericardial infusion, we were so incredibly concerned about it, happened 5% or 4% or 2% or whatever it is, even though it didn't kill anybody, they were in hospital for a longer period of time. Suppose the FDA then says, gosh, pericarditis, they're in the hospital, they have a pigtail catheter in, you're trying to decide how to best manage it, it happens 4% of the time or 3% of the time. It's an adverse event. And we're going to use that in your study compared to rivaroxaban or whatever it is that they're comparing it to. That's a huge deal because both events happened. Neither of them resulted in fatality. Neither of them resulted in any long-term morbidity. They increased the hospital stay. Both of those. Got to think about that in terms of trial design. It was a new device category. Anticipation of new anticoagulants, and somebody then can say, look back at PROTECT AF and say, gosh, it was warfarin. Nobody uses warfarin anymore, except for the fact that a lot of people use warfarin still. But they then say, well, of course, with the new agents, rivaroxaban would be much better. Apixaban, oh my gosh, it'd be much better. And that's then part of the background of these trial design issues as it relates to how the regulatory agencies, how our peers, how the other professionals in the field review this data. Since that time, we've had longer period of information, and we have from 600 to 1,500 patient-year data. Non-inferiority criteria are continued to be met with primary efficacy of 30% relative reduction in the Watchman group. But you remember, the trial was reported after a year, not after 1,500 patient years. All stroke, from 600 to 1,500 patient years. You can see the relative risk has gone from 0.96% down to 0.77% by virtue of the fact that indeed procedural-related strokes have been abolished. Now, suppose you happen to have chosen for random choice a low-risk group of patients, even though they had CHADS 2 scores. Suppose these were patients with CHADS 2 VASC scores, they were 1. Low risk. Maybe then your power calculations are going to be very different, and then your stroke rates are going to be very different. And so even though in the Watchman device it was 23% lower relative risk, that depends upon the number of events, and that was pointed out several times this morning, the number of events in the population that you're treating. On all-cause mortality, it has been 0.71 or 0.7. It's almost a 30% lower relative risk in the Watchman group. We need to remember that this carries out against the background that all of the new anticoagulant trials have included 15,000 patients. People then say, well, PROTECT-AF has 800, CAP has 400, or PREVAIL has 400. How can you possibly compare a trial that has 400 patients versus a trial that has 15,000 patients? It winds up being a big deal. And so then your confidence intervals wind up being incredibly important to compare those with, because that's what the regulatory agencies compare you with. Device versus one of the newer anticoagulants or one of the older anticoagulants that has 15,000 patients in it. The next piece of information is to say, well, you can look at primary efficacy in different ways. We talked about the study trial timelines. You could say intention to treat or post-procedure or per protocol or terminal therapy. Depending upon how you choose to do that, the rate ranges very widely from 0.71, which was what was seen in the PROTECT-AF using intention to treat, down to 0.55 with terminal therapy. Terminal therapy being that patient that got a device, at 45 days Coumadin was withdrawn, versus that group of patients who were randomized to Coumadin, who continued on over the next 5 years to be on Coumadin without any interruption. So depending upon how you set up your analysis design has huge implications. This has just come out now. Vivek has just published this. This looks at the primary efficacy by patient subgroup. That's new data for you. If you were to look at age or gender or CHADS 2 score, you can see that it all favors the device. This is that line of non-inferiority margin. Had you chosen that line differently, the results of your interpretation of the results would be different. But that non-inferiority margin was identified back in 2008 or 2006 or 2000, a long time ago. And so things changed during the course of time. What are the other things? You're familiar with the implant success. Is that still important? Well, it gets better and better and better. Procedure time, is that a terribly important metric? Well, it's felt by some to be a metric. We heard about the fact that, for example, if you were going to do transpericardial access and then had to put in a second device, some of the time it's a long procedure. Or if you add to the procedure ablation, then you're going to talk about procedural times that increase dramatically, irrespective of whether you put in a left atrial appendage occlusion device. Learning curve, we know about that. Implant success is better. Procedure time, as I mentioned, is better. The next piece of information is to say, and this Sean Ali in the audience over here in the middle has written this up, and has it just come out now? Just come out now on quality of life. As we get to patient-centric care, quality of life winds up being a huge issue. This is the only piece of information. So we only have one randomized trial. We only have one piece of information on quality of life in the only randomized trial. And Sean found that indeed, if you received the device rather than warfarin, you felt better. You didn't have to be concerned about cutting yourself when you were shaving. You didn't have to be concerned about not eating too much spinach or leafy vegetables because somebody said that would screw up your INR. How about then the final things? How about the functional impact of clinical events? Depends upon whether you use intention to treat or terminal therapy. The relative risk between left atrial closure and warfarin varies. But significant disability or death is always better with the device. And that will increasingly be part of comparative effectiveness research to look at quality of life as a primary endpoint. That is coming, for sure. Quality of life is a huge deal. What then at the very end of time did we wind up with in 2010? If you lived in UK, you could have said, well, percutaneous occlusion of the left atrial appendage is efficacious. And this gets back to what Michael Mack talked about, provided that patients are selected by a multidisciplinary heart team. So NICE back in 2010 found that to be the case. It is still the case. So we're going to need more and more emphasis on quality of life, on procedural performance, on the heart team. This is my final slide. Two of the greatest qualities in life are patience and some wisdom. We've had a lot of patience. We're getting more wisdom, and a meeting like this is all about wisdom generation. Thank you.